All right, I wanted to kind of jump ahead and show you where we're at with this. I've taken the contour lines for the headstock and for the heel, which I'll show you in a minute. I've taken those down with the files, and I've done some preliminary sanding with 60 grit, and I'm just kind of touching it right now with the 100 grit. We're going to go to 220 with this. Or somewhere around there if you're doing this at home and you don't have 220 on hand, anything that's kind of around there, 250, 200. You want to be able to get it smooth enough to where it holds the feel and the shape, but you also need it to grab a little bit, so that's why we have to sand it first of all, but also not sand it too high of a grade, because it has to, the lacquer that we put on here, the stain has to be able to grab. So you can kind of see here, with this particular shape that we're doing, the contour lines, if you look in the previous videos, were already kind of set for where we needed them. And it's really easy. You just follow, just like the facet lines on the back of the neck, you follow those on the headstock. Some tricks that you can do with your sandpaper. First of all, I remember showing you the files, the horse hoof files here, the heavy rasps, and I've got a different set of files here that just have different contours. This is a rounded file. I've got different levels, layers of teeth on here for the really tiny edges. Kind of some different variety here, and you can use all of these. But when you get down to the sanding, if you buy in sheets, you just tear off little sections. And I've got a sanding block here that I basically wrap my sandpaper in, just like that. And then I'll take this directly to wherever I'm sanding at for a flat surface. For rounded surfaces, I use a dowel, and it's the same thing here. I've actually got one kind of rolled up in this. You just wrap your sandpaper around it, and it allows you to be able to kind of get into those smaller areas. You also, on the edges, the corners, you want to take your corners down, just kind of go on angles, because the corners, they don't tend to hold a lot of lacquer. So when you're spraying your body or your neck with paint, clear coat, whatever you're doing, on the corners that are really sharp, the lacquer, the paint, or the stain, or whatever you're using is going to run off of those, and it's going to show bare spots, especially when you're doing sanding afterwards, because you don't just sand before you paint or you clear coat. You have to do it after. You have to wet sand just to get everything nice and smooth. And when you're doing that, you can take off a lot of layers. That's why you put on a lot of layers of paint, a lot of layers of lacquer, because you're going to eventually sand those down, and you want to have a nice, full, clear, smooth coating on there. So if you take down your corners just a bit, I don't know if you can kind of see, I'm just kind of rounding over the edges on these, just enough to where the lacquer is going to adhere and kind of stick around those edges, and they're not going to fall off. So when I do sand through, and you also want to go lighter on the corners when you're doing a sand through, or a sanding after lacquer. But at least I know that it's going to have a better chance of gripping and not breaking through if I kind of round over these edges. So I'm in the process right now of just doing that. I'm getting everything kind of ready for final sanding. I'll show you the heel. Get this clamp off here. So the heel is just kind of a similar thing. This particular one, I just took my facet lines and I continued the neck contour shape all the way up to that facet line, and then you just kind of blend the edges over, and you can have them very pronounced, not very pronounced, just kind of up to how you want to do it. When you get these areas here where there's a little bit of sanding burn, or that could be saw blade burn, just make sure to take that down. Just take sandpaper down a little bit. It doesn't take a lot. But the next step with this, is going to be taking the headstock down to thickness. So this is going to be cut down, and then we're going to round and smooth in the edge here, right to the fretboard. But for you guys, when you're checking to see if this is actually the way you want it, I showed you a contour gauge before, so I think this is the one I showed you here. We're going to use this one up here. It's a plastic one, and it doesn't bind as easy. So what we're going to do, we've got kind of our templates here, what we're looking for. These are the shapes that we're going for, and this would be 1st fret and 12th fret. So I'm trying to do this while holding the camera here. So what you do is come at right about where your 1st fret's at. And that's going to give you the shape of your neck. And then you can do a comparison to your original. And you can kind of see I'm right where I want to be, right there. And then you do the same thing with the 12th fret. So you go right around where the 12th fret's at. And I'm just guessing on here, guys, because I'm trying to hold this, do both these at the same time. It's kind of tricky. Okay, and then you take that, and you make that, you just kind of compare that to your original, and I'm right about where I want to be with that one as well. So, contour gauges, they're cheap. They're very, very cheap. They're inexpensive. You really want to do it if you're copying a different pattern. You don't really want to always go by feel. There's measurements you got to take here, the depth, 1st fret, 12th fret, how the heel joint and how the headstock joint are. So the next video I'm going to do, or it could be tagged onto this existing video, is going to be cutting down the headstock and rounding that over. I also need to deepen the fret slots because we initially cut those before we radius the fingerboard, but since we radius, we took it down on the sides naturally with the radius, and so they're not as deep as we need them to be. So I've got a specific saw that's going to go right to the depth we need it, and we're going to just re-deepen these, cut out the nut slot, we'll drill the tuner holes, and I don't know if I showed you in the video, I took the edges before I started shaping, and I took it with the router table over there, and I just used a bearing bit to get the fretboard straighter on the sides. I took it to the contour it needed to be. I know I looked back in other videos and I saw that before we had took it to the sides of it, that it looked a little off, so I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out, that before you start radiusing on the back, you got to make sure that you get your fingerboard on the same flat plane as the sides of the back of the neck, which I've done so far. So I'm going to jump on the next video, and we'll show you what we're doing with that. Okay. Okay, so we've basically cut the thickness down of the headstock, and the overhang on the fingerboard kind of juts out. What I've done is I've taken a small, heavy rounded rasp file here, and you just want to kind of taper down on the line and blend that right into the wood. Since this is the same thing, it's a maple fingerboard with a maple neck. The patterns are a little bit different, the grain patterns, but even though they're different, it still should blend in fairly well. The only thing you have to watch out for is if your filing lines are off, if they're not straight, you're going to notice the line of the join, which will be ever so slight. You're going to notice that that's not straight. So make sure when you're filing to keep that straight. And then you just kind of work your way down to a lot finer files. Work your way from there down to sandpaper. And then again, like I said, everything is just about pretty much 220 to 250 grit before you're doing the final lacquering and painting and all of that. So when I'm done with this, I'm just going to round over the edges a little bit. I'm going to mark it for the tuner holes, and then take care of the rest of it, get it ready for prep for paint, for stain, for lacquer, all of that. So we'll see you in a bit.